Raby. New South Wales Labor MP for Strathfield Jason Yat-sen Li. Chief economist at Barrenjoey Partners Joe Masters. And Professor at the ANU's National Security College and former Liberal Attorney General George Brandis. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Patricia Carvelis. I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we're broadcasting from tonight here in Sydney. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quandra is the hashtag. Please get involved wherever you might be. To get us started tonight, here's a question from Gail Hardiman. Hi, Gail.
Hi, Patricia. My question is to the panel. What does the panel think about the statement that the Treasurer admits that the government has a lot of ground to make up on helping Australians with cost of living? What action should they immediately take to reduce the burden on the majority of Australians?
Joe.
That's a great question, and it's one we're hearing from a lot of Australians. We know that Australians are hurting at the moment. We've seen the government already put in place some immediate policy relief. Every Australian received a tax cut on the 1st of July, and every Australian has received some sort of subsidy through their electricity. But to your point, people are still hurting, even after that. Now, the one thing that economics tells us that is hurting all Australians is actually inflation. And that's a point that the Reserve Bank Governor Bullock makes all of the time. So the truth is, the best thing we can do to help all Australians is bring inflation down. That means we need the government not to spend too much in the economy. We don't want them to stoke more inflation. Now, what can they do immediately? Well, they can still put in some policy relief for those Australians that are most vulnerable. But what we know from history is that relief has to be timely, it has to be temporary, and most importantly, it has to be targeted. So I wouldn't be surprised in the next budget if we see some extension of that electricity subsidies, if we see more subsidies coming through on rental subsidies, for example. But really, we need to keep aggregate demand running not too hot, and we need productivity enhancing reform. And I know that's boring for people who aren't economists, but what does that mean, right? It means reform that puts more capacity into the economy. The way I describe that is raises the speed limit of the economy. It means we can grow faster without high inflation, and it's high inflation that hurts everyone.
Gail, I just want to bring you back in. What have you noticed about the standard of living? What's changed in your life?
Well, if I could just address the one thing that you've said that only is helping people is electricity. What about dental, medical, house insurance, car insurance, registration, tolls on the road, petrol, groceries, the list goes on, and most people who are middle class and below are really, I don't know how they're getting by day, I seriously don't. How it's impacted me, we've cut back on, my husband and I have cut back right on our spending, going out for dinners, not using toll roads, not having numerous cups of coffee a day, really thinking about how we can save money, because it really is hurting everybody.
So what could the government do that would help your life?
Well, I think when we're talking about immediate action, it has to be immediate action. All of those things that I've just listed, how can the government be of some help in all of those areas? Think of people who won't go to a dentist now because they haven't got enough money to go to a dentist and get the work done. Surely that may be able to be helped through Medicare or something of that nature. But there's just so many aspects of what we're talking about here that need immediate attention. OK,
Jason, I just want to bring you in. Quite a list there, and you're in the state government, and quite a few of those things, including tolls, are actually very much state responsibilities. This is the vexed nature of our federation.
Absolutely. And I think governments right across Australia are acutely aware of the pressures that people across Australia are facing. I think governments are already doing a lot around these things. So the federal government, cheaper medicines, cheaper childcare, tax relief in terms of the stage 3 tax cuts. At the state government level, if you think about my electorate of Strathfield, if you think about an average four-person household in Strathfield, what are the major hits to their household budgets? Cost of housing. And so one of the biggest things that the New South Wales government is trying to build more homes. Transport as well, we've got a $60 toll cap. So the maximum that a resident will spend on tolls is $60 a week. And there are some families in my electorate that spend over $10,000 a year on tolls. It's just extraordinary. But I'd say this, I don't think as a government you can ever do enough to ease the cost of living for people, because it's never going to be enough. I think what's really important is that governments can present a vision for a future that is optimistic, that people can see a way out and lay out a roadmap in order to get to that future. I think Australians are tough and resilient, but governments need to give people hope. And I think if people have that hope, and the economy's getting better. I mean, Joe would know more. The economy's improving. You know, inflation has halved. Interest rates will hopefully come down this year. Jobs are created. Wages are up. So there is hope on the horizon, but it's important for governments to give people that hope.
Well, Jason, we actually have polled on this, and most Australians say they don't feel like they're getting ahead financially, even as inflation eases across the economy. A new Q&A poll by YouGov found more than 6 in 10 report going backwards, including 40% of Australians who say they're barely getting by. Asked to compare their financial situation to the same time last year, more than 40% are worse off. A similar number report they're about even, and just 2 in 10 say they are better off than they were 12 months ago. So, George Brandis, bringing you in, I mean, this is a similar story to what was happening in the United States. We know what happened there. As you see it, you're no longer in the political system. There's a big fight on cost of living. Do you think there should be more provided?
Well, I think, first of all, Patricia, that what that survey reports, people's lived experience, is the reality, because the reality is we are in a per capita recession at the moment. And although Jason talks about having an optimistic vision for the future, with respect, that's rhetoric. What the government should be doing is addressing the productivity crisis that Joe has referred to. Now, early last year, the Productivity Commission published a major report in which the red lights were flashing in that report about the decline of productivity growth in Australia. And rather than taking the report seriously, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, ridiculed the report, and then later in the year introduced legislation, industrial relations legislation at the behest of the trade unions who control the Labor Party, that were the most anti-productivity, re-regulatory industrial relations laws that Australia has seen since before the time of the Hawke government.
But there were also a lot of laws that they'd taken to the electorate.
A lot of the laws that Tony Burke, in his former portfolio, introduced had not been, in fact, taken to the electorate at the last federal election. Now, you can't, on the one hand, say that we need to address the productivity crisis and, at the same time, refuse to take seriously the Productivity Commission's warnings and introduce regressive anti-productivity industrial relations laws, and to make the system much more rigid than it had been for more than 30 years.
Gail, you can hear the panel and their response. Productivity reforms, IR identified there. Are they things that you think would help? I mean, I suspect they'd take a bit longer to kick in.
Yeah, I think it's more of an immediate nature. And when I think of how the government's sold out, privatised so many areas of our lives, and they can keep putting the prices up and up and up they go, particularly on the toll roads and all this sort of stuff. You know, for somebody to go from Penrith, say, to even Parramatta or into the city to go to work, it's costing them a heck of a lot of money. Myself, my husband and I, our grocery shop, I mean, the grocery shop is just staggering. And I don't know, personally, knowing a number of people who don't have a house, they're paying rent every week. And if they've got a couple of children, how do they pay rent, pay all these heavy tolls, huge grocery bills, education, medical, the list just goes on. And I think people are getting to the point where they've lost all hope in there being a better way of life than what they're experiencing now. So it's crucial. It's absolutely crucial that something be done immediately.
Well, it's certainly going to shape the next election, there's no doubt about it. Next, we'll hear from Rami Mayo.
Hi. Notwithstanding Trump's impulsive and controversial behaviour, what are the likely ripple effects of an American-Chinese trade conflict on Australian households and consumer spending?
Geoff.
Thanks, PK. Look, it's still early days. I mean, we have seen the shape now of the full Trump cabinet, and there's certainly a number of very tough, well-established China hawks in the cabinet. Trump's been very clear that he intends to impose punitive tariffs on China, perhaps up to 60%. How it plays out is still, I think, uncertain. There could well be an extended period of negotiation like there was under Trump 1.0, and it may not end up being as draconian as it now appears. What I would say, though, and I think we need to be very clear about this, that anything that harms China's economic growth harms Australia. I mean, we may not like that, but that's the reality. Over a third of our exports go to China. Many Chinese study here, come as tourists. That affects the regional areas of Australia as well. And so, look, it's just a brutal reality because of the profound complementarity between the two economies. We are always going to have this high level of interdependency. So it's certainly going to be very damaging to Australia if Trump were to do what he said he intends to do.
Joe Masters, I'm wondering if you can quantify, just if you've got a chief economist, let's make him do some maths. If Trump slaps 60% tariffs on China, what's the flow-on impact on jobs and our economy here?
So it's not just about the 60% tariff on China. Trump has also proposed a 10 to 20% tariff on everybody else. And that's really important because if we look back to Trump's first presidency, he slapped material tariffs on a number of goods from China. And what we saw is that actually production moved to other countries, Vietnam, Pakistan, Mexico, for example. So the global supply chain could shift to some extent. That's much harder to do if you've got 60% on China and 10 to 20% on everybody else. So the economic damage is higher. Now, as we've discussed, we don't know what the final tariffs will look like, and I suspect it won't be as bad as the worst case. But the worst case could take something like 2% off China growth. And China growth is already slower than it's been over the last decade or so. So to put some numbers on it, and as always, these are best guesses, we estimate that China has been growing at about 5%. We think that growth could be down to about 4%, literally in the next year. And the flow through of that takes about 0.2% off Australian growth. Now, that may not sound like very much, but it hits all parts of our economy. It hits business profits, which inhibits their ability to invest and employ. It hits incomes of Australian households. And importantly, it hits the government revenue, federal governments and in Queensland and WA. And so it inhibits their ability to help offset that economic hit and also to address cost of living. OK, George Brandis, so what do we do?
So I completely agree with what Geoff Raby had to say, that anything that damages China, and particularly anything that weakens demand, China's demand for what we sell to China, is going to have an obvious impact on the Australian economy and flow-through effects across all the sectors of our economy. But can I make a broader point? There are very few countries in the world that are more exposed to international trade and free trade than Australia. We are a trading nation, we're an exporting nation. So we are sort of towards the front of the queue of nations that will be prejudiced by American protectionism and American economic nationalism. We will be very much the losers in a global trade war. And I don't think we should assume that the success that Malcolm Turnbull had, for example, with Trump 1.0 in getting an exemption from the steel and aluminium tariffs that Trump imposed way back then would be repeated.
Why not?
I think that reflected, among other things, the fact that Malcolm Turnbull was very, very good at managing Donald Trump, much better than virtually any other world leader. And I don't think that we should necessarily expect to have that.
Well, we don't know how
don't know.
Anthony Albanese or potentially Peter Dutton was to win the election.
But I wouldn't be holding my breath.
Why not? You don't think they've got the acumen?
I think that there was a particular relationship between Turnbull and Trump. They got each other. They were, in some ways, from similar backgrounds. They were big bullying
they were similar
billionaires. In some respects, in most respects not, but in some respects, certainly as businessmen, in some respects, yes.
Okay.
PK, I'd hate to detract anything from Malcolm Turnbull. Nothing at all. We love Malcolm. But I think to George's point, which is that's very spot on, is that this is a different Republican Party around Trump. These are different people in the cabinet than were there last time.
Than the first version.
Trump 1.0 had traditionalist Republicans, and they would have been very, very influential.
Okay, but Marco Rubio will be there. I mean, there are some more establishment.
Yeah, but they're brought onto the MAGA agenda completely.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's a different complexion.
Okay, Jason.
Just wanted to really quickly. I've spoken to a number of friends in China who do a lot of investing. They put forward a different view. They are more optimistic about it. Their argument is that China exports to America are only about 15% of overall Chinese exports now. China exports a lot more to the global south now, and that was a deliberate strategy to diversify. In other words, China is more prepared for Trump 2.0 than they were for Trump 1.0. And so their sense is that 60% tariffs, if they were to happen on China, won't have too much of an impact, particularly when they say 50% of China trade with the global south is done in renminbi. Now, it's no longer done in US dollars. Their view is that China is not so good with... China likes transactional people. China's not so good with ideologues. And so their view is that there will be some sort of a deal done, allowing each side to save face, because the reality is a trade war is going to hurt everybody.
Well, it is true that Trump and Xi negotiated in Trump's first presidency. So that's the first thing. We do know that they can come together and find common ground. I think the second point is that Trump himself is more prepared this time. He expected to win. He's won convincingly, popular vote, strong mandate, and he knows Washington. He's moving much faster. Even the appointments he's made to date are 5 times faster than Biden made appointments and 4 times faster than his first presidency. So he's prepared and ready to go.
I think that's right, but these are not... None of these people are the sort of traditional Washington appointees. And, you know, to Geoff's point, it is a very different Republican Party, but also because he has control of the Senate and the House of Representatives, and because he's got a lot more freedom of action with the result he received at the election, I think he will be more unconstrained than Trump 1.0 was.
Okay. We're going to keep this discussion going with a question from Eagle Zhang.
Hey, my question is, the potential conflicts between China and Taiwan could become a tipping point for our regional stabilities. What would be the best strategy for Australia if such conflicts arise?
I'll start with you, Geoff.
Thanks, PK. Look, I'll be controversial on this point.
Oh, what are you going to say?
Yes. It wouldn't be me if I wasn't. But look, I've written a lot about this. And I discount heavily any military action by the People's Republic of China against Taiwan. I don't think, and I've said this for a long time, Beijing has a viable military option in Taiwan. And if nothing would have demonstrated more clearly to the doubters in Beijing who may have wished or hoped to think that they had a military option, Putin's disastrous invasion of Ukraine just shows that that's not going to be a very very sensible policy course to pursue. And after all, I mean, think of Xi Jinping. He's got to pull the trigger. He could blow up the whole show, himself, the party, if it goes pear-shaped. And the last time China was involved in a military conflict was 1979, when it invaded Vietnam after the Vietnam War and was defeated. Now, this is...
But isn't this their stated objective of what they want to do?
Absolutely. And I think it helps to maintain stability that it is the stated objective. I think it helps to maintain stability that when a provocative act like Nancy Pelosi, the then Speaker of the House, goes to Taipei, that China throws the sink at it, because that is reinforcing the red lines. And Beijing never wants to cross the red lines and go into conflict. It's just too dangerous. It's too improbable. And I think if there ever was a military option available to Beijing, they would have used it a long time ago.
Eagle, you've got friends and family there. Is it something that worries you?
Yeah, because I grew up in Fujian province, which is just directly opposite to Taiwan. My friend just told me about 2 weeks ago, because they have been seeing these military aircrafts flying through constantly. So they are thinking actually to stock piling food and to buy a big tent so that they can flee to mountains when things happen. So it feels quite serious now.
Right, so the sense among your friends is that they're preparing for the worst.
Yes.
Does that surprise you?
It does surprise me. I'm sure we'll discuss later on the challenges facing the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is not in a very good state at the moment. China would have watched very closely the sort of sanctions that were applied to Russia. I agree with Geoff. The cost to China in proactively going after Taiwan, I think, would just be too great. The risk, I think, that we face is a miscalculation, something unplanned, some incident where it escalates. And so I think it is just so important. Well, first of all, it's so important that we have direct dialogue with the leadership in China. But it's so important that the international community can put in place guardrails and rules and systems by which any sort of conflict can be quickly de-escalated. Otherwise, something unplanned might happen, and that would be absolutely the nightmare scenario. Yeah.
George Brandis, I want to take you to the question, and Eagle, I'm quoting you because we've seen your question, that what is the best strategy for Australia if that conflict arose?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer in the abstract, because it depends on the circumstances in which there were to be conflict between China and Taiwan. Now, I would always defer to Geoff Raby's greater subject matter expertise on this point. But can I add another observation as well? Geoff talks about Ukraine. Taiwan is a lot harder to invade than Ukraine. Immensely harder to invade than Ukraine. Increasingly, I think, in the national security community, there is a view that if there were to be a ramping up of hostile intent, it would be more likely to be in the form of a blockade than in an invasion. And that presents its own set of policy choices and responses as well. In the event that there were to be some form of escalation of conflict, whether an invasion, which I suspect Geoff is right personally, or a blockade or something that elevates the level of tension significantly beyond where it is at the moment, then Australia's response will, to a degree, depend upon America's response. Because we are very much, I think, bound to, because of our relationships with the United States, because of the presence of American troops in Northern Australia, because of Pine Gap and so forth, the nature of Australia's response will be importantly shaped by the response that America adopts.
And do we know what that American response would be under a Trump presidency?
Well, like everything else about President Trump, it's very difficult to say. What we do know, though, is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the former senator from Florida, is one of the more predictable and rational actors around Trump. He is a China hawk. He's also somebody who has taken a great deal more interest in the Indo-Pacific than most of those around Trump.
Our next question comes from Xavier Paps. Hi, Xavier.
Hi. I was wondering how the recent US election result will impact our relationship with China and how this could change depending on the result of next year's federal election.
Jason.
The recent US election result,
Yeah, so
the
Trump's
impact
election.
on Trump's election, how that will impact our relationship with China. And so I'm just paraphrasing so I understand your question. And the result of the federal election next year, in other words, if the coalition were to, God forbid, win government win government.
Tell us what you really think, Jason.
What would that?
God might not forbid that, you know, Jason.
What would that?
I think
that mean?
God's a swinging voter.
So for the first question, I don't think that a Trump presidency 2.0 will have a significant effect on the way we relate to China. I think that our interests, our national interests vis-a-vis China is quite different from America's national interest vis-a-vis China. Economically, we're one of few countries, as I said, that runs a big trade surplus with China. America loses $300 billion a year in trade with China. And most importantly, we're not, this is the Strathfield view of superpower competition. We are not a superpower. You know, we are not in a superpower competition with China, except maybe in the swimming pool. So I don't think Trump presidency will impact how we relate to China. We will need to continue to walk that line. The Prime Minister puts it very well. We collaborate where we can, we disagree where we must, and we act in our national interest.
Is that line harder to walk now?
I don't think it is because of the election of Donald Trump. I think we need to work very hard to define and expand the areas where we can collaborate, to shrink down the areas where we need to disagree, and we need to be very, very clear what our national interest is. Now, what would happen if, God forbid, the coalition were to win the federal election next year? It's very hard to say. My gut instinct is that it's hard for a leopard to change its spots. As a Chinese Australian, I think back to the dark days of the China-Australia relationship. That was an awful, awful time for Chinese Australians, where not only were we sort of vilified because the People's Republic of China was seen as extremely unfriendly to Australia and outward we look Chinese, so we really copped it in COVID, and we certainly don't want to go back to those days. And I think it is one of the best achievements of the Albanese Labor government to bring that relationship back on track, together with a number of other international relationships that have been restored.
Well, we asked Australians how important they think relations with our biggest trading partner are. According to our Q&A YouGov poll, more than half rate the relationship as very important, while 40% say it shouldn't be prioritised over other countries. Compare that to ties with the United States, where the election of Donald Trump seems to have Australians questioning our reliance on America. More than half, 55%, now say we can't rely on the US and should be prepared to stand on our own 2 feet, which is fascinating, George Brandis, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's also wrong.
Well, it's how Australians feel.
Sure, and I think that view.
Voters are always right.
I think the view that we can't rely on the United States is fundamentally not correct for this reason. Now, I have been pretty strong in my criticism of Donald Trump. I think he is a very erratic actor, and for reasons that we all know, it's very difficult to make predictions about what he might do. That having been said, the ANZUS Treaty is a bedrock, which is not in it's not in contestation in Washington. It's not in contestation among those around Donald Trump. Nor do I believe is AUKUS. So the United States, I think, will continue because of ANZUS, because of AUKUS, because of historical relationships which will be enduring well beyond the presidency of a president who can only have one more term, the sentiment in Congress will be enduring. So I think those foundational elements of the relationship between Australia and the United States, which include, of course, the ANZUS security guarantee, which include our joint development of the AUKUS submarine program and Pillar 2 programs as well, is not going to change because of Donald Trump. And for that reason, I think people who take fright and think because Trump himself is an erratic actor, the United States will no longer be a reliable partner with respect, wrong.
OK. Joe, can we afford to aggravate China?
Look, China's our largest trading partner, as Jason said, takes about a third of our exports. It's about $220 billion a year, so it's very important to us. I think what's important to remember, though, is that Australia's long navigated this balancing act of our trading relationship with China and our strategic relationship with the US. This is not new. It's become a little bit more complex, not just because of the Trump presidency, but because the world is becoming more isolationist and more bipolarised and more fragmented and more fragile. So it's important, but actually our starting point, our relationship with China is, to Jason's point, is better than it's been in years. So regardless of who wins the next federal election, it is critical that we maintain conversation across a number of levels of government, but also across businesses. So whoever wins has to maintain that, and we'll continue to walk this very fine balancing act. Geoff?
Yeah, look, I have to come back on George's comments about ANZUS in particular. Conservative politicians in this country have for 60-odd years put enormous weight on ANZUS, but it's actually a very thin reed to hang your national security on. It's important. We value what we have, but we must never overstate it and exaggerate its usefulness to us. And certainly there is no predictability, there is no certainty. As for AUKUS, if I don't get the acronyms mixed up, with AUKUS, it's probably never going to happen. I think the key point here with Trump is that with Trump's transactional approach, with a falling away of ideology from US foreign policy, and a much greater emphasis on the art of the deal, on pragmatism, I think we're going to see less US emphasis on alliances everywhere. We saw Trump 1.0, the pressure he put on Europe over the NATO alliance. I think Biden did a good job in building this, what we call lattice work, of bilateral, trilateral, minilateral alliances through the Asia-Pacific, but I think they will be much less well attended than they were. And I think, Joe, we're in a multipolar world, not a bipolar world, and the issue of US primacy I don't think will matter as much as it has. And if the US learns to live in a world where it doesn't have primacy, then, and I think Trump probably couldn't care about primacy. I don't think he could care about primacy. If that's the sort of world we live in, it may actually be an easier world for us to navigate our own foreign policy in.
That's very interesting. If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A Live with Jason Yat-sen Li, Geoff Raby, Joe Masters and George Brandis. Quick one from you. Why isn't AUKUS ever going to happen?
Well, look, I'm not an expert in these things, but there's a huge price tag on it. The US is way behind in its own submarine building program. Who would build I'm sorry, George, you were the High Commissioner to London and you did a fabulous job. Who would ever go in with British shipyards?
You made a fabulous job of something that we don't think is going to happen.
Who would ever go in the British shipyards and try and build a ship in Britain? I mean, they can't even service their submarines, let alone build fresh ones.
Briefly?
Can I come back at you on that, Geoff? Two things. First of all, I think there is this view that is being promoted that submarine building in Britain is a cottage industry. It's certainly not on the scope and scale of the United States industry, but it certainly is not a cottage industry. But secondly, the most advanced for this purpose, shipyard in the world is being built at Osborne in Australia by BAE, the prime contractor. So this is the idea that because British naval shipyards are old, and some of them are, you can go back to the 19th century, in fact,
I rest my case.
Because some of them are, it's a mistake to assume that those are the facilities that are going to be the construction facilities for the British contribution to the SSN AUKUS. They are going to be built at Osborne, which will be, when it is fully commissioned, the most advanced naval shipyard in the world.
We're going to park that and get to... There's a lot tonight, so let's get to our final 2024 show. Come on, Simon Potts. Hi, Simon.
Thank you. A US commentator recently said Trump's victory was partly because working-class Americans felt ignored when raising their concerns. As a small business owner, I've felt the same here in Australia. Responses from politicians have sometimes been limited or dismissive of the issues I've raised. With an election coming, what lessons can the government learn from the US, and what steps will they take to show they're truly listening to everyday Australians and addressing their concerns?
Simon, what is your business and what are you concerned about?
I got a B2B business and we supply cardboard boxes and packaging to other businesses, and there's things like the cost of living, you know, just like people's personal lives, businesses have rising costs, you know, electricity's going up, insurance is going up, all those sorts of things. Then on top of that, there's new workplace reforms, which extra effort, and I'm worried about some of the things that that's going to lead to and the difficulty that it's going to cause running my business.
And you feel like you're ignored in the conversation about cost of living, like businesses are not part of that conversation?
Well, I've taken it upon myself to write to a number of politicians recently, probably over the last 6 months, and I've sent emails and things like that to about 10 different politicians on both sides that are responsible for these kinds of issues. And sometimes people don't get back to you, sometimes there's long delays, sometimes they give a limited response, like a more general response, rather than answering the specific concerns that I've asked. But basically what I'm saying in this question is that I'm just an everyday Australian and just a regular guy trying to have a go, and I'm not used to speaking on TV like this, and quite frankly...
Well, welcome.
Well, quite frankly, it's scary, you know what I mean? And lots of people don't want to do it. But there's lots of people like me. I'm not a seasoned professional like you or some of you guys, and that means that sometimes I might fumble my words or not present things as the government wants me to, and we need simpler access for people to be able to present their concerns so that they can be addressed.
Jason?
I hope you haven't written to Strathfield. I'm pretty confident that you haven't written to Strathfield.
Well, that would be a gotcha moment.
We would have come back. I think your concerns are real. I actually think it's really important for elected representatives like myself to not only get back to you. We should be going out and seeking your input into the policy making process, because unfortunately a lot of politicians spend their entire career in politics, don't necessarily have a lot of real world experience. So we have advisory boards for young people, for business, for multiculturalism. We proactively go out to seek input about what we can do better. So I'd encourage you to not just write to your politicians, ring up the electorate offices and make appointments to go and see them and talk to them about the challenges that you're facing. I think the business community, in particular small businesses, are really the backbone of the Australian economy. And if we are to, I was shocked the other day when looking at, I think it's called the complexity, the economic complexity index. And out of 133 countries, guess where we rank? We rank like 93, which is between...
That's in our complexity.
In our complexity, which is our ability to manufacture and export.
Joe looks very ready to tell us about the complexity.
It's a pet topic.
So at 93, we are between Uganda and Pakistan. Number one is Japan. It goes Japan, Switzerland, South Korea, Singapore, I think. But we're at number 93, and so we really need to lift our economic complexity. And I think innovation within the small business community, businesses such as yours, is absolutely crucial to that. So as governments across Australia should be doing a lot more to listen to businesses like yours.
Jo, I'll draw you to the question, but then about the complexity.
Yeah, let's
make that less complex.
let's come back to that. First of all, thank you for sharing your issues, and I hope they get heard from being brave and speaking out on Q&A. Secondly, Jason, you're quite right. Small business in Australia is the backbone of our economy. It is the largest employer in our economy, and it often does it tough. So we've talked about electricity rebates for households, but there haven't actually been material sort of cost of living relief, if you like, for small businesses. Look, I'm always the economist, right? So I'm going to come back to the comment I think I opened this Q&A with, which is inflation hurts everyone. And as you said, we typically think about that in a household context, but small business often faces similar sort of basket of goods and services in order to run their business. So the best thing we can do in a really broad sense for you is to bring inflation down for everyone and to get people, both people and individuals and businesses, to get their ability to buy things, their purchasing power, back to where it was in 2019. And we're a long way from that. If we look about the household sector, disposable income is 16% below where it was in 2019, right? So we've got a long way to go just to feel like purchasing power is back. I guess the other thing is around, you mentioned industrial relations, and we've talked a bit about IR and productivity. And again, productivity is a word that economists use and no one really understands. But effectively, what we want to do is make doing business easier. So red tape, regulation, green tape, I'm not sure if that impacts your industry, but maybe a little bit. IR, the infrastructure that we have in our economy, being able to access the subsidies and help from government is often very difficult and very complex. So they're the things that we want to do, make doing business easier and bring inflation down so that the economy can work better than it has been doing. And I hope that you see some things in the next budget that comes forward, because important employer. I do want to address the complexity index because this is something that it's published every year, and every year I get flooded with questions about it. What it really does, what it measures, is actually the diversity of our export base. And one of the reasons Australia performs so poorly is because commodities, and particularly iron ore, are such a large part of our export base, right? So we score poorly because we have this great gift from nature that we dig out of the ground and we sell. And in effect, every Australian benefits from that because it comes through government revenue and government redistributes it in the economy. Mining companies employ and they invest. So if you take mining out and put that to one side, the complexities of our exports don't actually look that bad. In fact, we are world leaders in ag tech, for example, in med tech is another example. They just get dwarfed by iron ore, coal, gas, and also to some extent international tourists, which are now our fourth biggest export.
That's interesting. Thank you. Great explanation. Now we're going to take a question from Yumi Lee. Hi, Yumi.
Hello. Thank you for taking my question. I'm a community worker with the Older Women's Network, and I often hear stories from older women who are homeless, sleeping in their cars, their vans, and also perfecting the art of couch surfing. So unfortunately, I cannot offer them hope because the housing situation is so dire. There is a complete lack of affordable, accessible, long-term housing for them. Every time a new housing report drops, we get calls from the journalists saying, have you got a case study? Have you got an older woman who's sleeping in a car? So my question to politicians is, how many case studies do you need? How bad do the statistics have to get before we see housing, that real investment in social public housing, and more importantly, taxation reform that will make housing a human right and not an investor right?
Wow. Jason, now I know that in New South Wales you have several housing policies and that there is a big push here, but on that substantial question about taxation, we've got Allegra Spender and others who have said that this needs to happen. Would you like to see the federal government embrace that?
I'd say a couple of things. I think the economists that support that winding back of capital gains tax and negative gearing concessions, the distortionary impacts on the housing market. I'd make the point that in 2019, the Labor Party took that to a federal election.
It was a while ago.
It was 4 years ago.
Things have changed a lot.
And it was soundly rejected. But
all right, we don't do booing here.
But I would say, I mean, it's a fact. It's what happened. But that said, we are in a generational housing crisis right now. There is a generation of people who are locked out of safe, high-quality housing, and we need to pull on all policy levers to resolve that. Now, at the state level, as you said, we are really putting in place some pretty revolutionary planning reforms. That's part of the picture. There's a cost issue with building housing at the moment. I was talking to some property industry people. The cost price to deliver a two-bedroom apartment in Sydney now is some $600,000 or $700,000. That's just the cost price to it. So it's a complex thing to do. But I would say to people who are vulnerable on housing, older women, victims of domestic and family violence, young people, essential workers as well. The New South Wales government, we've committed $5.1 billion to build 8,400 public homes. 50% of those will go towards victims of domestic and family violence. We've done a land audit of public land where we can build more housing, more public housing, in order to cater for those vulnerable and essential groups. So, in terms of the New South Wales government, and I suspect it was certainly the federal government in terms of their policy agenda on housing as well, the Housing Future Fund, the shared equity scheme, the build-to-rent schemes, all the governments across Australia are focused on housing. It's not an issue that's going to be fixed overnight. It's going to take time.
It is. To do it. George Brandis, I want to bring you in because currently, you know, clearly the heat is on this government. Today the Greens stopped their opposition to the government's two housing bills, but the coalition is still opposed to those bills, so it will take the Greens' support to get it through the Senate. Does everyone have to get out of the way whenever there's a housing plan and just, you know, green light to anything? It's that desperate.
I don't agree with that at all. I think what we need is the right policies, and I think the reason the coalition is opposing the shared equity scheme is it's the wrong policy. Now, Andrew Bragg, the Shadow Minister for Housing Affordability, has announced two policies which are much better policies, in my view, than Albanese is offering. First is to allow people to access their superannuation, their own money, up to, I think it's $50,000 or 40% of their balance, to invest in their own asset.
But that's inflationary, isn't it?
And for ideological reasons. The Labor Party has opposed that. The other policy that the coalition has announced is a freeze on foreign acquisitions of residential property, and so much of the cost pressures in the system have come from foreign investor acquisitions in residential property. Now, you're absolutely right, if I may say so. You're absolutely right. There is a housing crisis in Australia. This year, there will be 160,000 homes completed. That is the lowest number of housing completions since 1989.
But it didn't happen overnight.
35 years ago. No, it didn't happen
really
overnight, but I mean, nobody has failed to notice that for most of the last several years, most governments, state and federal, have been Labor governments. And in my state, I come from Queensland, the Labor government in Queensland several years ago announced with lots of bells and whistles a new housing affordability scheme. Not a single new house was built as a result of that scheme.
Yumi, you're frustrated. Obviously, there's a lot of work going on housing, but there is always a delay till we see some of the results. Has this been a long build? How have you seen it?
I think for the older women that we advocate and lobby for, we see this as what we're living through now is the fruits of policies of politicians that have made very bad decisions years and years ago. And so we are living through that. And they see it's really unfair because those people live on a very good pension and they are now homeless, these older women. So you're right. It is very difficult to see an overnight solution to this. We want the political parties to stop using housing as a political game and see the people who are actually suffering through this crisis and stop blaming each other, stop blaming migrants, stop blaming international students, and just get to investment in social and affordable
I want to get to my next question. Quick answer.
I completely agree, and that is exactly what the New South Wales government is doing. And I can say more than 50% of everybody who walks into my office, through my door, have a housing-related issue. And these are tough issues.
More than 50%?
More than 50%. It's always housing-related, and the waiting list is so long. But every now and then we can help people. We had an 84-year-old grandmother who was kicked out of her home because of a dispute between her son and his wife. Luckily, we were able to connect her with the right government services, and within 3 months she was able to find a public home. So every now and then we can do something, but it is a big challenge.
Jo?
Look, this is a critical issue, right? One of the fastest growing cohorts of Australians in poverty is women over the age of 50 who don't own a home. And we need to address it, and we need to address it now. Now, building more houses immediately is actually really complex. Clearly that's a big part of the issue. But we also need to have better integration with our social welfare net. And that's the bedrock of Australian society. So we need to be making sure that that net is capturing these vulnerable and newly vulnerable. They may not perhaps be as typical as people that were vulnerable 20 years ago. We also want to make sure that we're helping people that are on the cusp of vulnerability. We really want to address the problem at that stage before these women become homeless. So there's lots that we need to be doing, and we absolutely need to be doing a better job. And there are a number of federal and state government initiatives, but we need to be calling it out because this is a new cohort of women, of Australians who are suffering.
Quick.
Can I just make this point? I know it must sound frustrating to hear the different sides of politics blame each other. But can I just make this point? Somebody has to take responsibility. There is a problem. There's a huge problem. It didn't happen by accident.
No, but I've got to challenge you on that, because that would mean that you, as a former member, because I think it's important, also take responsibility. There is a lot of policies that have led us to this point.
I agree with that, Patricia, but the point I'm trying to make is this. Somebody has to take responsibility, and part of taking responsibility is identifying mistakes that have been made that brought us here, and one of the ways in which you do that is to have a healthy debate about what policies work and what policies don't. And that will involve necessarily an argument between political parties. Now, in my view, the policies of the side of politics I represented are more likely to solve the problem than the shared equity scheme, for example, that Albanese is promising that will only produce another 10,000 houses a year anyway. But it's healthy to have a debate about the causes of an identified problem and the solution.
I think you're right that a debate is important. Just blame with no kind of attribution to solutions
I'm not
drives
saying that
people
at all.
You're not.
Actually, also,
but that does drive people crazy, I think.
If we look back over the last 15 or 20 years, actually almost all of our housing policy has largely been around helping first home buyers into the property market by giving them money in different varieties or forms, directly or indirectly. And what those 10 or 15 years have shown us is that that helps that individual person who buys a home, but it actually drives up prices for everyone that comes behind them. So we actually need to have a really broad-reaching debate, and it has to put supply at the centre of that.
I agree.
We need to build more houses, and they need to be the right houses in the right location with the right infrastructure for the right type of family or occupant.
Well, I can promise you this show has put a big focus on it, and we will next year's election year too. Let's hear from Steve Coe now.
Oh, hi. I have lived both in China and Hong Kong, and I saw with my own eyes the culture of coercion by the Chinese authorities over there. To displease Beijing by advocating for human rights or even the principle of freedom would invite certain arrests or even you just simply disappeared. But you know what? Who are we to interfere? Who are we to ask them, to tell them what to do, how to govern? How would we like it if they were to tell us how to do things in Australia, in our own country?
Geoff?
Yeah, it's a very complex question, but a very good one. Look, I mean, in the past, and I used to chair it on the Australian side at one stage, we had a bilateral human rights dialogue with China. And we would raise a whole raft of issues. I think it was a very good mechanism. They would also raise issues with us, Indigenous conditions and so on. And that was, I think, a very healthy dialogue. For a mix of reasons, that no longer exists. But the Australian government, representing the Australian community, takes a strong and firm and consistent position on human rights. We are a member of the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And to your point about it being a national issue, signatories to the UN Declaration see human rights as universal and non-separable. So from an Australian point of view, we will listen and recognise that some countries will say, well, we have prioritised economic development and growth over freedom of speech, for example. But for Australia, we don't recognise that. We say all human rights are equal and equally valued. What you do about it, particularly when you're dealing with big and powerful states, is another question. I think the key thing for us is to always be consistent and persistent. And I think pretty much Australian governments of both sides, over my almost 30 years of involvement directly in it, have done that. And I think we're recognised as a strong advocate globally for human rights.
Jason, you've got parents from Hong Kong.
I do. And I thought Hong Kong was a magical place. It just had, those of you who know Hong Kong, the old Hong Kong, that magical combination of the Cantonese and the British administration. It was a magical place. And sadly, I think a lot of that is lost now. But I'd say this, I think a nation's foreign policy has to absolutely be an authentic reflection of that country's values and its character. If it's not, it's just fake. People know that. So we cannot be anything other than authentically Australian when we project our foreign policy. And I think countries, such as China respect that. And I would say, even though we've been advocating always consistently, regardless of the government, I think, for human rights, we managed to secure the release of Cheng Lei in that, and I think that was a very important achievement.
Now let's get a question, our last question for the night, from Kay Chan Gardner.
So many young people have connections to family and friends purely because of social media. How are you going to support young people who are who are concerned about losing their connections? And do you agree that this bill could potentially do more harm than good for some individuals aged under 16?
OK, so this is the social media ban for under 16s. George Brandis, you believe in free speech. What do you think of it?
I'm sceptical, frankly. I wonder how it's going to work. I wonder if there are sufficient guardrails. I wonder if there has been sufficient consideration given to the very issues that you've just raised. So I think the intent of the bill to protect young people from malicious and evil and harmful material is a good intent. I think the intent is very pure, and I don't think it's a free speech issue. That having been said, I wonder how it is going to work.
So you don't think it's going to work?
I don't have the expertise to offer a view.
Kay Chan, are you worried about it?
I just Yeah, a little bit. I just think it sets an unpleasant precedent, to be honest.
What is that precedent?
The precedent is that it's okay to restrict access to information. And just in terms of, I think surely the answer is actually more information. Surely it's education that will solve this.
Jason, final word to you.
I think there is, for me, compelling evidence that social media, unrestricted social media, is causing all sorts of harm and damage to our young people. And I think it's a responsibility of governments to act against that, number one. Number two, I convened my youth advisory, the mighty Strathfield Youth Advisory Board came in and we asked them these questions. These are Year 10, Year 11 students. The nuance that they had to the conversation was extraordinary. They said, the texting, the communication was not the problem. That was very useful. They said the most damaging thing was short-form content. It's the reels that suck you into the death sort of... And the young, they know it's bad, but they just can't...
Well, no, it's addictive, and that is the point. All right, We're out of time, but thank you so much to our panel tonight. Jason Yat-sen Li, Geoff Raby, Joe Masters and George Brandis. And this is the last show for 2024. It's been a massive year. You've set the agenda with your questions and experiences, and I've loved trying to get you some answers. Q&A is and always will be your show. We'll be back in February, just in time for the federal election. I can't wait. Good night.
Tomorrow on News Breakfast, we head back to the world of Moana and chat to the voices behind the highly anticipated Disney sequel.
And as the blockbuster AFLW season comes to an end, we'll chat to the winner of this year's Best and Fairest at the W Awards.